Thank you. All right. So first of all, thank you for the super warm welcome. It's always such a pleasure and an honor to talk to founders, engineers, and entrepreneurs, my favorite people. So what I thought we'd do today is I'll walk you through my story in technology in Silicon Valley and share some lessons that I've learned through that journey. So what I'll start off with is me at the age of 22 graduating from college. So I went to university at Carnegie Mellon, which is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the USA. And when I was graduating, basically all of the smart kids in my class had this really interesting decision to make with their lives, which is, are you going to go work on Wall Street and shuffle money around for the rest of your life? Or do you want to create something that has actual value? And I remember going to all of these banks and these hedge funds and interviewing with them and walking away with the sense that, essentially what is the hard problem that you're actually solving? Did I go to university and study computer science to essentially write software for a bank? Or did I go to build products that could hopefully one day change people's lives? And I think one of the best decisions I ever made was to not go work on Wall Street in 2004, which was, and at that point, Wall Street was the most interesting, dominant industry in America. And instead, I ended up taking a job working at Oracle. And the job was essentially hacking on the database kernel, right? And the big lesson I take away from that decision is that you have to focus on essentially providing real user value and working on really hard problems, because that's what keeps you motivated and essentially going for a long time. So at Oracle, we were actually trying to solve a pretty hard problem. And this was a little bit ahead of its time because machine learning, deep learning, and so on is really sexy today. But in 2004, what we were trying to do is that what if you could make the database kernel self-healing and self-optimizing, which is that instead of needing to employ, most companies that essentially deploy Oracle have an army of DBAs helping them to run essentially the database. What if you could make the database essentially optimize and run itself? And it was a pretty cool problem to solve. So, I went there, started hacking on it, and I was having fun and I remember this conversation super clearly, until about 9 months in, I walked into my manager's office and I asked her, hey, I wrote a bunch of really good code. When is it actually going to get deployed? When is the first time that a customer will essentially run this and get some value from it? And she just looked me straight in the face and she said, probably 3 more years. And I was like, wait, you mean that for almost 4 years, I'll have no feedback on the code that I wrote? That means how am I going to get better as an engineer? How am I going to know that we're actually solving real user problems? And on the day itself, I basically decided that I was going to go find another job in Silicon Valley. So I started tinkering around on my own, essentially trying out some startup ideas. But in one of those crazy fortuitous moments in Silicon Valley, I happened to run into Mark Zuckerberg in the summer of 2005. And this was it was interesting. How many of you have seen the Facebook movie? Okay, cool. So you know that the scene in the beginning of the movie where they are actually all in the Facebook house and there's a zip line? That's a real story. And I remember when Mark called me over, he's like, yo, you should come hang out at the house and you should, essentially come talk to us about if you want a job here. I'm like, oh, this is going to be a formal interview. So I actually wore slacks and a shirt and I walk in and Zuck's there in his pajamas, right? And I'm just like, okay, what's going on here? Is this a real company? But when I spent an hour there talking to them about why they were building what they were building, some of the technology challenges, I remember thinking that I've never used Facebook because it launched at my university after I graduated, but this is a set of people and an environment that I want to be around. And it doesn't actually matter as much exactly what I'm working on as long as I'm doing it with people that I love. And that's the second big lesson from Facebook, which was that you want to focus on hard problems. That was my first lesson. But if you're not doing it in an environment that you love showing up to every day, you cannot give it your all. So you need both of those. So moving on, so I joined Facebook. When I joined, it was about 10 people in the first handful of engineers. And on my second day at Facebook, Mark walks in and he's like, hey, you should write the Facebook search engine. I'm like, what do you mean? I have no idea how to write a Facebook search engine. Nobody taught me how to do that. And he looks me straight in the face and he's like, yeah, but nobody taught me how to write Facebook. So if I can write Facebook, why can't you write the Facebook search engine? I'm like, yeah, that makes logical sense. So I'm a big fan of logic. So I think that, and then it took me about 3 or 4 months, but I wrote the Facebook search engine. And after that, I helped to write Facebook newsfeed, the Facebook ads platform. And I was the first engineering manager there, the first engineering director. And I think that the big lesson from that whole Facebook story was that if you're an entrepreneur, almost by definition, nobody's done what you're doing. Because if it was already done, then why the hell are you doing it, right? So you have to be comfortable, like waking up every day and knowing that, okay, nobody's done what I've done before, but I'm the best person in the world to be able to solve this because I'm motivated enough and I actually can essentially trust myself enough to do it, right? Because it's so easy to get psyched out when you're at a startup where you're just like, wow, this is really hard. I don't know if it's possible. Yeah, that's why you're doing the startup. If you knew if it was possible, then probably somebody would have already done it. So the Facebook experience was an insane rocket ship ride for 5.5, 6 years. And then I left mostly because I felt that I wasn't learning quickly enough, which is an odd thing to say for a company that went from 500,000 users when I joined to about 800 million when I left. But anyways, I have high expectations. So I left, and I asked myself, okay, what is the hardest thing that you can tackle? So I thought, okay, I went to college. I joined a big company. I joined a small company that became a big company. So hence, I should go start my own company because I've never done that before. And that's how I can really put myself into the most uncomfortable zone for myself. So me, along with 2 co-founders from Facebook, one of whom was my wife, we started a company called Cove, which was trying to build modern collaboration software. And Cove was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life because, well, there are many reasons, but one of the big ones was that when you're used to a company like Facebook, with the rate of growth that we saw, you tend to become really impatient. And you're asking yourself, okay, I'm working on this startup. Why is it not essentially growing at the same rate as Facebook? As you get older, as I got older, I realized those are not realistic expectations. A company like Facebook comes around once every generation. So what you really need to learn is how to be patient and build a long-term company. Because by definition, building a long-term company takes the long term. Right? It's not going to happen overnight, and you have to keep at it. So we'd been working on the startup for about 18 months when Drew and Raj, who had been good friends for a while, essentially, kind of came to me and my co-founders, and they said that, hey, this thing that you guys are working on, which is this modern collaboration software, that's actually a big part of what we want to achieve in the long run as well. So why don't you come on board and essentially join forces? And so we were pretty convinced by that argument because one of the big things that Mark at Facebook had taught us is that as a founder, as a CEO, it's too easy to get focused on essentially the ego part of being kind of like the boss. Whereas if you're really motivated by the mission and the impact, then you owe it to yourself to ask yourself, is there some other company that is working on essentially the same thing that I'm working on that will help me achieve that mission and impact earlier, right? So we were convinced by Drew and Rash's argument, and they were amazing people. And they kind of checked all of the other boxes that I'd learned through my career. Working on hard problems, check. Working with a group of people that I love, check. Working on essentially things that I'd never done before, essentially leading the entire engineering team, check. So I joined Dropbox in just about 5 years ago, actually, in February of 2012, and it's been a crazy ride so far. We have grown from 70 people to upwards of 17 or 1,800 today. We were all, essentially in an office that was about this big when I joined, and now we're in 12 offices across the world. We have grown from less than 50 million users to upwards of 500 million users today. And we've grown from very little revenue to a lot, which which I won't give the numbers for. But I think it's been fascinating that through this journey, just to try to be able to essentially pattern match, what are the lessons that were constant at Facebook versus pretty different at Dropbox. And the one thing I'll share that I think is fascinating about this is that both of those companies, in many ways, are very similar, but in some pretty interesting ways are fundamentally different as well. And I think the most interesting one for me is highlighted by essentially a value that we really cared about at Facebook versus the value that we really cared about at Dropbox. And the one is at Facebook was move fast and break things. And when you hear that value today, you're like, oh, yeah, obviously you want to iterate quickly, you want to fail fast. But as a software engineer, when you're actually being trained in your craft, what you're actually taught to do is the last thing you want to do is to have buggy software. Like, why would you ever want to have buggy software? That doesn't actually compute. It doesn't make sense. But for Facebook, which is really essentially a product that is completely predicated on the number of people in the network, it completely made sense for us to ignore the last 10% of perfection that you generally go for in software systems and instead like iterate really quickly, because it didn't matter if we had the world's best social networking software if nobody was on it, right? And I contrast that with Dropbox, where one of our big values is sweat the details, which means we actually pride ourselves as an engineering team to get that last 10% correct. And the big reason for that is if your Dropbox did not work 10% of the time, you'd think your computer was broken. And the kinds of like workflows and the kinds of things that we enable people to do, people, teams, companies, is just so mission critical in a way that at least Facebook early on never was. And once you have those values that you believe in, it actually permeates all the way down into everything from your hiring to your performance reviews to essentially what you like value as a company. So I think that in some ways, again, coming back, both Dropbox and Facebook are very similar, but they're also very different in different ways. So I think that the last lesson maybe I'll share with you is that as all of you are either scaling companies or starting companies, I'd encourage you to think really hard about what is it about your particular product that you think that what is a unique, like essentially cultural aspect that you need to integrate into your company to make it succeed, and not just essentially blindly follow what Dropbox has done or what Facebook has done, but really think of it from first principles in terms of like what is important for your company to succeed. So that in a nutshell is the last 15 years of my life. And maybe with that, we can get Erica back here for questions.
First of all, I wanted to thank you again for being here with us tonight. We're very, very happy to have you.
It's a pleasure.
So something that you said that really struck me right now when you were talking is you mentioned something about impact. Well, kind of, I'll explain myself. Mm-hmm. So basically, one of the reasons why a lot of people want to become an entrepreneur is because they want to have big impact in the world. And actually, what we say to them is that is not necessarily a valid reason to become an entrepreneur, because, for example, the average employee or an engineer at Google or Facebook could have far more impact in the world than most startups who actually most of them fail. The people who created Google Maps, for example, the guys who created Facebook at work right now, they're having much more impact in the world than your average startup. So how do you feel about that, and how does it feel to have worked for companies that have had a huge impact in the world?
I'll answer the last part first because that's the easier one. I think that the one thing I think about when in terms of so the work that we did at Facebook and we're doing today at Dropbox is how satisfying it is to wake up every day and to know that nobody can ever take that away from you. It doesn't actually matter like what the stock price is, what the valuation is. Like the big thing that matters is that you build something that a lot of people care about, right? And that's something that you can take with you to your grave and like really feel as though like there was a life well lived and there was something that like you made an impact really. But when I come back to thinking about like how you should think about your calculus for what you want to do, I think having a big impact is obviously one part of it, but you also need to be working in an environment that you find like personally satisfying, creative, and like really like gets you going, right? Because I think the flip side of working at I won't use Facebook as an example, that's an amazing company, but the flip side of working at a company like Oracle is that you are building good software, but it's an environment that is not like really getting the best out of you. So I think you need to both be in an environment that really motivates you, be working on a big problem that you care about, and also be in a place that's like forcing you to learn. So you kind of need to check all the boxes, I think. Yeah.
I obviously agree. Yeah. So I read that you grew up in 7 different countries.
Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, my father used to move around a lot for work. So I was born in India, but I lived in Cameroon in Africa, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Thailand for a bit, and China as well. And it's interesting. I wonder if like one of the reasons why I'm pretty comfortable with change, especially where I work, is because early on I realized there was so much volatility is the wrong word, but comfort with change in kind of like where essentially growing up. So I grew up in 24 different houses, so we used to move around quite a bit. And you kind of realize that like you don't take anything for granted, and it's always you're kind of aware you are where you are, and you're kind of pretty comfortable changing it up. So I think one of the reasons maybe I'm so comfortable with going to new initiatives in my work part of my life is because of this implicit thing that my mom and dad taught me growing up.
Yeah, and just to continue on the personal stuff, I have to admit I did a decent amount of online stalking before this interview. I went on your Facebook and everything. I actually read about you and your wife's story, which I thought was a very beautiful one. Actually, I think a movie should be made out of it.
Well, she's a pretty one in the family, so yeah, okay.
So basically, you guys met during your studies, then you worked together at Oracle, and then you worked together at Facebook, where she was actually the first female engineer. Then you guys went on to co-found a startup together, which was acquired by Dropbox, where she also joined as an employee, and then she later left to pursue a career in venture capital. And you also became a father last year.
That's
Congratulations.
the latest project, yes.
I know everything about you now. First of all, obviously you're a big in favor of working with your partner, spouse, but can you tell us a little bit more about that, what it's like, and what are maybe the advantages of doing that?
I think I get this question often. It's a great question. What I'd say is that it really is what you're looking for from your spouse and kind of like in general, like your family life and your setup, right? So what I've found is that because I have somebody who is working with me on the projects that I care about every day, there's never a dull moment between the two of us, because there's never a question of like, hey, what is the most important thing in your life? And anything I talk to her about, she gets it. And the cool thing is, that means that when we ship something amazing, we can share that experience together in a way that is much more meaningful, as opposed to if she didn't know anything about technology. I mean, obviously, hopefully, she'd be a supportive spouse, but it wouldn't have that same level of understanding in terms of like what I'd managed to achieve. But it had its flip side, as most things do, which is that when shit's not going well, you actually don't have that space that you can sometimes need in order to have like a safe space that you come back to, because I'll come back home, I'm like, hey, Ruch, man, this shit didn't go well. And she's like, yeah, that was pretty bad. Because she knows it, right? And so I think that ultimately, you can either have a life that optimizes for higher highs at the potential of lower lows, right, in terms of your own psychology, or you can seek more stability. And I think it's not a surprise that as entrepreneurs, you kind of always are drawn towards the higher highs. So it's not surprising to me that this is a consistent life decision that I've made, both in terms of how I've approached my career and also how my wife has chosen me. I did not choose her, exactly. Yeah.
What about work-life balance, if there is any, especially now?
I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't say that I'm great at that yet. I think one of the things that's been interesting in having a child is that, so there was Ruchi living with me in our house. So she obviously understands technology. My 3-month-old son does not give a shit about technology, right? And it's been really interesting to kind of have this amazing new being in my life that does not care about anything that I thought was the most important thing since I started working. And that is when I think work-life balance at least for me, prior to having a kid, was not something I really understood. But it's actually one of my 2017 New Year resolutions, which is to get to the point where work-life balance is just not something that you're shooting for because it sounds like the right thing to do, but it's something because there's this new person in my life who actually really needs it from me in a way that we need to come to balance with that, which is going to be an interesting challenge, but I really want to figure that out.
Yeah. So going back to the Facebook early days, you already mentioned that briefly earlier, but I wanted to know what that was like. You were one of the first 10 employees at Facebook. You joined when there were 700,000 or less than a million
users.
Active users. And when you left 6 years later, there were 700 million.
7 or 800 million, yeah.
Yeah, and you were overseeing 2,000 engineers, something like that?
No. I think the engineering team was probably maybe 500.
Yeah. Okay. So, anyway, what was it like working at the house in the early days at Facebook?
It didn't feel like work. It felt that every day you woke up and you basically had this thing that you really cared about, and it really felt like your baby, and you went to the office and you hung out with your friends for like 14, 15 hours, like trying to solve this problem. And it was so much chaos, because every day you'd walk in and you'd be like, this is the set of things I think I'm supposed to do, but you'd probably end up doing 50% different things. So it always felt like a new challenge. And we never stopped back to think. There was no time to actually think about even like the rocket ship that we were on, because it literally was you wake up, you shower, you go to work, You come back home, you fall asleep, and you kind of do that again, 6 or 7 days a week. But it was just so much adrenaline. This sense of like we are on this shared adventure together, and come hell or high water, regardless of essentially how successful we might be, my God, we're gonna have fun along the way, right? And you're doing it with a bunch of friends, and there's just no way that will ever end badly. Like if you could look back on any time period in your life and you said, yeah, I had 3 years jamming on shit with my friends, it's like, yeah, you're going to feel a sense of success, right? Like regardless of exactly how it turns out. So I think that, interestingly enough, like, and these were decidedly less frothy days in Silicon Valley, but we never at Facebook ever thought about like valuation, about like stock price. This is not even something that occurred to us, because all we were just focused on is like, let's like write code with our friends, right? Which is, yeah, those are pretty magical times. Yeah,
I bet. So more about your transition to Dropbox. And joining the company. So basically, you came at a time where you were transitioning from a more personal software strategy to a more business one. And how was it like? How did you manage the transition with the engineering teams? And what has changed since you joined Dropbox?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a great question because Dropbox is this unique company which obviously started off as this amazing consumer file syncing and storage tool. And kind of on the back of that, we got to like hundreds of millions of users. But along the way, it also was very apparent was that we were providing a tremendous amount of value to people in like companies, big and small, across the spectrum. So the challenge that we have in front of us, and like we have done a good job of solving, is that how do you retain the DNA of a consumer company, essentially like focusing on the user, simplicity, design, while also understanding that if you are building software for businesses, then you have a much higher bar for like reliability, performance, and uptime. And I think it's really important that you not go too far in either direction, because I think that the temptation of a pure consumer software company is that you don't spend enough time really listening to your customers, and you're basically essentially like building things from your intuition and your vision. And I think the temptation of an enterprise software company sometimes is almost like listening too much to your customers and not actually having a strong point of view in terms of like the product that you want to build. So I think that once you internalize that, again, this is one of those interesting cases, right, which is there has been no enterprise software company built in the history of technology that has managed to span both, one leg in the consumer world and one leg in the enterprise software world. So once you realize that nobody's kind of done this before, then it kind of frees you up to almost think about these things from first principles and really think about like, what is the exact structure of our engineering team, our product team, our design team, our customer service team, such that all of them are able to build together and really like span the gamut of like, okay, we're going to build like a consumer company, but we're going to sell in some sense like an enterprise software company and listen to our customers. So I think that's been the biggest change, which is like, how do we not really think of ourselves as either one, but this new modern hybrid, which is really like in between.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it came at a time where B2B software was starting to look a lot more like B2C software. Like I read somewhere like you actually realized that the software you were building for individuals was something that companies also wanted. They were expecting the same kind of familiarity in the user interface.
Yeah, because it's kind of insane, right? If you kind of think about the functionality and the capabilities that we have in our personal part of our life versus the work part of our life, some of these differences are frankly like just insane to me. I can search through all of the human knowledge ever created in any language that I want in 1 second on my phone right now. Like I can do that for you, right? Yet if I asked you, can you search through like all of the information that your company has produced in the last 1 week, it's still an unsolved problem. Like why does this disparity exist? And when you ask yourself that question, you start realizing that it's because of the way that B2B software has been essentially built and sold for the last like 20 years. Because historically, we were essentially building for the buyer, not for the user. Because the only way you could get your software into a company was that you would go beg, wine and dine the CIO, the IT administrators to be like, hey, can you please deploy my software in your company? And often that was like a 6, 12, 15-month process before you had the first chance of actually having anything deployed to the company. And then you'd only release software, and I'm kind of repeating my Oracle days, you'd only release the software once every 2 or 3 years, which meant that like over a 20-year horizon, you'd get 10 shots on goal. to like actually improve your software, and you compare that to a company like Facebook, Google, or us, we are shipping like hundreds of experiments on a daily basis. And for each of those experiments, the majority of them are going to fail. But I know that like every day, our product and our software is getting better. And this is like this evolution cycle and evolution speed that we've just never seen in like B2B software. So I'm actually really excited. And also, because you're focusing on the user, you actually get to build stuff that people want, not people think that they want, right? So I'm actually really excited about the future of modern business software, modern enterprise software, because I think our experiences at work deserve to be a lot better than they are today.
Yeah. Totally agree. So just to get back to your role as a CTO when managing and scaling an engineering team of a company that is doing times 10 every year. So that's a lot of people to hire. And obviously, hiring is a big problem a big topic for any startup. So how do you compete with talent in the Valley? How do you compete, retain, and attract talent there?
I think that the biggest thing that I've seen that engineers are looking for is the problem that you're trying to solve big enough? Like, can you paint a picture for them as to like, why is what you're trying to do just like fundamentally hard? Because I think that it's easy to think of engineers as kind of being like these super, like regimented, like linear thinkers, but I actually think the best engineers are way closer to essentially like, artists who are kind of like more motivated by what is the most ambitious, insane project that I can work on, so that when I look back on my career, I can be like, I actually achieved some like crazy shit, right? So I think step one is like, can you essentially ensure that your problems are big enough? And thankfully at Dropbox, like if you're trying to build an internet scale file system, both for like normal users and for every company in the world, we're fortunate to actually like be tackling a really big problem. The second part of it is, and this makes my job a little hard sometimes, I was talking to Adrian about this, is that the best engineers don't really want to be told what to do. Like, can you create an environment that really like allows them to express their creativity in a way that is not top-down structured? So we have this great quote at Dropbox that I really believe in, which is that as a management team, our job is to provide strategic guidance. So we believe that like 80% of strategy comes top-down. And that really means like which areas are we going to compete in, which areas are we essentially going to play in, and why that makes sense. But true innovation actually happens 80% bottoms up. Right? I'm not writing code on a daily basis, right? I'm not designing pixels. So if you can really create an environment where the problem is big enough and like essentially the company understands like strategically why this is an important place to go to, and then you give people room. You give people room to innovate, to build, to fail, and to fail fast, then I think you actually have the best of both worlds, which is people are coming to you for the right reasons, and people are staying because you have created an environment that's fun to work in and also like impactful.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I could talk about that topic, but I read somewhere that on Facebook, like when you join the engineering team on day 2, you're basically shipping code that's live. And I read that one of your challenges at Dropbox was to maintain that agility while also ensuring the last 10% of perfection that you were talking about. And I also read something pretty amazing is that whenever one of your teams was lacking a certain skill, you would actually encourage people to have someone in the team learn that. And so, I mean, I could go on forever, but that's
yeah.
really
I mean, those are amazing topics. So we'll cover some of those. Okay. So one of the big things. So a lot of the folks were pretty early engineers at Facebook. Most of us didn't actually have a ton of industry experience. I'd say that out of the first 10 or 15 engineers, I don't think anybody had more than 2 years of experience. And one of the things that had really rubbed all of us the wrong way is that when we joined our first company, the first thing you'd do is to be told that you should go read the code. Go read the architecture, like diagrams, go read, like figure out how it works. But one of the really interesting side effects of that system is that what you're implicitly telling the person is that you are not qualified or good enough to work on my code base until you basically go learn shit for the first 1 or 2 months. And implicitly what you're sending the signal is that we don't expect you to be as productive for the first 6 months maybe until you have ramped up. So the question we asked ourselves is like, okay, let's flip that around 100%. Because the message that we want every Facebook engineer and Dropbox engineer is on day 2 to basically be like, I am as good as everybody else here. I have the same expectations of myself. I have to ship as much code as everyone else here. And it doesn't matter if I've been here for 2 days or I've been here for 6 months. Like everybody is expected to be shipping as much code as possible. So when we kind of played that out, we were just like, oh, okay. What this means is that by day 2, at Dropbox and Facebook, we need to set up a system where you have your dev environment ready, you have the code base downloaded, and you need to get your first bug fix in by 2 p.m. on Tuesday, so it can be part of the daily push at 4 p.m. And if you didn't, it would be essentially like, people would be like, whoa, dude, you didn't finish your first bug fix in 24 hours. And I think it was a really powerful system because, as the company grew, as the company scaled, even engineers who had come from really, more traditional backgrounds really accepted that as a challenge, which is obviously I'm going to ship some code on my first 24 hours. But here was actually the interesting thing, which is that if you're creating an environment which is inherently somewhat risky and prone to a little bit of failure, you also have to celebrate the failure. So one of the other traditions that we have is that the first time this was at Facebook, the first time that somebody brings down the product, or Facebook went down in the early days, we would send an email to the whole company saying that was success. You're moving fast enough. You brought down Facebook. And again, it's kind of pretty counterintuitive to set up a system that is so radical in accepting failure. But I think this all comes back to the same quality, the value, which is if you move fast and break things, what are the set of things that you need to do in your company to truly embrace that and to truly get people to live that experience from day one? Because you have to indoctrinate them, right? Because they're coming from pretty radically different backgrounds. At Dropbox, obviously, this is a little bit trickier because if you bring Dropbox down every week, that's bad. That's really bad. So instead, what we have tried to come up with is a slightly softer version of essentially the fail fast, which is we have invested a lot, essentially, our internal build systems, our internal testing, so that we can ensure that we know before a product, kind of a change goes out to our entire user base, we'll know it because it breaks for the whole, the company first, as opposed to our entire user base. So at Facebook, famously, we didn't write any unit tests for the first few hundred engineers we were there, because we were just why write a unit test if you can just release to everyone and see what breaks? And at Dropbox, it's pretty radically different, where we've invested a lot more in internal testing and kind of phased rollouts.
What is your biggest technical challenge right now at Dropbox?
What is our biggest technical challenge at Dropbox right now? Well, it's a little hard to talk about our future technical challenges without kind of giving away our product roadmap. So I'll answer a modified version of that, which is some of the biggest things that we have done over the last couple of years that I'm really proud of. So the first big thing is that we migrated off AWS, where we basically hosted all our data. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we have migrated all of that data, which is in excess of 500 petabytes, which I think is 500 million gigabytes, into our entirely inbuilt, essentially end-to-end hardware and software infrastructure. And we did this migration for 500 million users without a single user noticing. We did not lose any data. We had zero downtime. It was a completely seamless transition. And I was incredibly proud of the team for that, because when I first started at Dropbox, keep in mind that when you're running on top of AWS, what that really means is that you have built zero expertise in things like networking or hardware design. So we basically had to build up those that functions essentially from scratch, and then essentially put them onto this crazy project and tell them that by the way, we expect you to do this without anyone noticing. And they managed to pull that off, which I was very happy about. The second big thing that we did over the course of the last year was that we improved the shipping rate of our desktop client software, which for many reasons has gotten much more slower than I would like, and we increased that by 600%. So we basically are now shipping desktop client software 6x faster than we used to, and that took a ton of investment in essentially our unit testing across different platforms, and essentially across all of these things that we use to make sure that auto-updating, kind of reliability, and so on. But that was a really meaningful achievement, because that means we are basically moving 6 times as fast on the Dropbox client. And I do believe that, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I believe that we are now the fastest shipping desktop software in the world, which makes me proud. Yeah.
I've always been a big fan of Drew's philosophy to keep Dropbox simple as a storage and synchronization tool. And when I was in TechCrunch Disrupt last year in San Francisco, I've seen a change in the speech, positioning Dropbox not only as a storage company, but as a collaboration company. And I think that's a big strategical shift for you. And I was wondering, since like last September, what have you done in terms of product to go on that collaboration strategy? And what do you plan to do if it's not confidential?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for the compliment. I do think that one of the biggest things we have managed to pull off as a company over the last couple of years is really understanding that we started off by just being a file storage and file syncing and sharing company, but our mission has really expanded since then. And the way we talk about it is that we have gone from a company that keeps files in sync to a company that's trying to keep teams in sync. And that's motivated in large part in seeing like how people have used Dropbox since the early days, right? If I look at the set of things that we have released over the last 12 months, everything from better workflow products to better like document scanning to signatures on your iPhone, we've really like doubled down on essentially like the idea of content-based collaboration and allowing people to really. It's not just a blob of data that is stored in Dropbox, but more about like what can you do with that data that is stored in Dropbox? Like what are the common flows that every kind of team needs? Going forward, I'd say that a good area that, so a big area that we're investing in is going essentially an area for a product called Dropbox Paper. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's kind of an interesting hybrid between a modern, simple, real-time, essentially document editor that's also a wiki that also allows you to essentially like cut down on the amount of email that you get at work, right? And more, obviously we're very excited about the product itself. What I find more interesting is how that second product is following so many of the same kind of principles that we had with our first product, which is that it's simple. We expect it to be used both for like individual use cases and team use cases. And we expect that the adoption in companies will likely be bottoms up. And it will be brought because people are loving using the product as opposed to necessarily a wall-to-wall deployment that is through the CIO's office. Yeah. So yeah, it's fun times.
How do you give space to people you hire?
You mean literally in terms of giving them room to innovate, like right?
In action, in time.
Yeah. I think it's. I don't have a terribly sophisticated answer to that, but it's quite literally. I don't tell people exactly how to do their jobs. The question. I'm not giving people answers. I'm just asking them the right questions, right? So as a good example of this, maybe tactically, is that every week, me and my counterpart, who's the head of product, Todd Jackson, we hold basically our review for all of the things that are in our pipeline. And the big rule that we have for ourselves in that review is that we're never going to give people, like, even if you know the answer, we're never going to tell them the answer. All we're going to be doing is like asking the right sets of questions that hopefully will get people to answer the questions for themselves, but more importantly, come to answers that we don't know. Because I fundamentally believe that our engineering team, everyone in our engineering team is like, given that I haven't been coding regularly for the last like 3 or 4, is as good an engineer as I am. So if you basically constrict the ability of the company to how smart I am or Drew is or Todd is, then we're just not making use of all the talent that we have. But it takes a certain amount of, in my humility, I think, to know that like you might not know all the answers yourself, even though that is the first thing that as a leader you kind of like are tempted to do, right? Which is that I'm supposed to know all the answers. But if you can instead convince yourself that there are actually people who are as smart as you in the room, then I think it leads to pretty interesting outcomes. And I think in particular, Drew and Arash, our co-founders, are amazing at this. They're both incredibly humble. And I think that the set of people that I work with pretty closely, kind of like our management team, which we call staff, really does feel like a set of peers who are able to challenge themselves and really like trust each other to actually have the space to figure things out, which is fun.
If you find a company who is valued that much.
So I'm going to just repeat your question, so I got it right. So is your question, what advice would I give you to create a $10 billion company? Well, I'd say that you should focus on building something that, number one, is something that people really care about, right? And also, it's a little tricky because if anybody ever told you that they were starting off, if an entrepreneur came to me and they told me like, hey, it is my objective to create a $100 billion company, I'd be like, you have no idea what you're talking about. Because nobody who created a $100 billion company ever knew that they were creating a $100 billion company on day one, right? The best that you have is to solve an idea that you're passionate about and that you think is a big enough thing that like you can get the, like as an entrepreneur, if you're starting off, just get the first 100,000 users, right? If you can get 100,000 people to actually love your product and maybe some set of them essentially like are paying for it or are creating a monetization model, then I think that's a pretty good start. And I think honestly, like this is, maybe mistake is a strong word, but this is my big learning from Cove, because like one of the big, kind of learnings was that, you can't go into starting a company saying that I want to create the next essentially generational software company. Like instead, focus on solving a problem that you deeply care about, and hopefully over time it becomes like exponentially successful. But it's pretty hard to know that a priori. Yeah.
As we work on Facebook, we know that Google and Facebook collect every day huge amounts of data. So I'd like to know your point of view on data privacy, because it's been a huge deal these last years.
I knew there was going to be somebody that was going to ask that, so I'm glad you did. I think the way I would answer it is that it's more an observation on, I think, Silicon Valley, which is the culture of Silicon Valley, kind of like this, this counterculture, like, we basically are going to go against the grain. We're basically going to challenge all the status quo. And that's really positive because it allows us as companies to not accept anything for face value and to really like think about things from first principles. But one of the unfortunate side effects has been that I think technology companies just have not engaged with the policymakers, because historically we have viewed them as being setting the rules and it's our job to break them, right? And also like we just haven't had the kind of deep policy dialogue that I think is important to be able to actually have a constructive debate about like what does data privacy in the age of like cloud services mean, right? Like as a society, are we willing to not use Google Maps because Google Maps like needs the data for me to work? Like, and how does Google Maps get better? The only way it can get better is if it actually gets all that data, right? So I think we just haven't yet, we don't even have the language, in my opinion, or like the right abstractions to like, if we wanted to go have a constructive debate, whether it be one government in the world or honestly like all of the 200 nations, because it turns out that every nation also wants something different. So I think that one of the interesting evolutions over the next 4 to 8 years as technology plays a much bigger part in our life, like technology companies can't ignore that debate. Like we have to engage with policymakers across the world, and we have to make it constructive. We can't make it like antagonistic, which I think historically has kind of been a little bit more the case. So my view is that we need to figure out how to talk about this as a society, because I don't think we have the right tools today. But I do think we need to make progress on that.
So it's kind of two questions.
Oh,
You
that's
can answer
okay.
it in one.
Well played. Okay.
So first of all, I would like to know, what do you think about the entrepreneurs that are starting their own company by themselves? Do you believe that you have to have a team, or if you have an idea that you believe in, can you start by yourself? Like, what's your point of view on that? Mm-hmm. And also, how did you handle the self-doubt that entrepreneurs have at the beginning when you started your own company?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think, in my opinion, it's pretty hard to start a company as by yourself, because I think that it is such an emotionally and intellectually intense experience that having somebody that is your partner, that essentially you can share your best hopes with and also your like worst fears. I just think it's much healthier. That's not saying that that's the only model to kind of starting a company, but I do think it is much healthier if you have like a team to do it with yourself. For that second part of your question, what I'd say is that I think it's not that kind of like that manic depressive, kind of like at 12 o'clock, you're just like, my product's going to win. And by 6 p.m., you're like, I'm completely going to lose on a daily basis. That roller coaster, I think I don't think it's a function necessarily of whether you're like a startup entrepreneur. I just think it's a function of our industry. Because one of my favorite books is by Andy Grove, and it's called Only the Paranoid Survive. And it kind of makes a really compelling case why in any industry where you can essentially like grow companies so quickly, you're bound to see a tremendous amount of creative destruction, right? So that kind of roller coaster ride that you're describing, I still feel that regularly. And I just think that's like a function of like our industry, which is also what makes it really fun, because we get to build high growth companies. But it's also why like you always need to be looking behind yourselves, because you're like, I'm winning today, but it's really easy for somebody to build something else that could take me out, right? So I think you just got to internalize that if you're playing this game, like the game that you're choosing, that is the game. The game is like kind of the crazy roller coaster ride, and you just need to get comfortable with that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I really wanted to thank you. Before you went on stage, you told me that you were tired, but I wish I had half of your energy when I'm tired. Seriously. You were great. Yeah. Thank you, guys, and let's give them a big round of applause.
Que la famille.